When you spend 4 mana on a creature, you expect to get something pretty significant back. Like a creature that is reasonable at attacking and blocking, or maybe even has a useful ability. However, not all 4-drop creatures are created equal. Some of them have no relevant abilities and are horrible at attacking and blocking, and some of them even actively help you lose the game. These cards aren't fit to be played in 40 card, 60 card, or 100 card formats. In this video, we'll look at exactly those types of cards, as I'm going to give you my picks for the 10 worst 4-drop creatures in the history of Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, I've got Aquus Steed. For 3 generic and a blue, it's a 1/3, and it comes with an activated ability. For 2 generic and a blue, it can give target creature -2/-0 until end of turn. Yeah, you know a list is full of awful cards when the number 10 card is a 4-mana 1/3 with an incredibly weak and overcosted activated ability, but compared to the other cards on the list, this is pretty good. The cards in front of it all have even worse stat lines and or have insurmountable downsides. Lowering a creature's power is a fairly weak effect to begin with, as it rarely alters combat in a massive way. I mean, sure, your Aquus Steed can now block a 4/4 if you have 3 mana up, congratulations, but you're sinking 3 mana into what amounts to not much more than a bad fog effect, and that's just not what you want to be doing if you're trying to win. At number 9, it's Samite Alchemist. For 3 generic and a white, it's a 0/2, and you can spend 2 white mana and tap it to prevent the next 4 damage that would be dealt to target creature you control. If things ended there, this probably wouldn't be on the list, but they had to tack on a pretty huge downside. The creature you prevent damage to gets tapped and doesn't untap during your next untap step. Of course, that doesn't untap thing isn't the only downside. Playing a 4-mana 0/2 is itself a pretty massive problem, and that, combined with the fact that it stuns your creature, is a whole lot of downside for an effect that is already inherently narrow and underwhelming. You have to have 2 white mana up at the exact right time for this to be relevant, and even when it does do something, it's often like Aquus Steed's ability, where it just helps your creature survive without doing anything to your opponent's board or improving your own. At number 8, it's Viridian Scout. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 1/2, and you can pay 2 generic and a green and sacrifice it to deal 2 damage to target creature with flying. As with Aquus Steed and Samite Alchemist, you're overpaying for the stat line here, and its ability is similarly underpowered as well. Paying 3 mana and giving this up to take down an X2 flyer just doesn't even get close to moving the needle. Look at it this way. You have to spend 7 total mana before this does 2 damage to a flyer. And it's not like the creature that is sitting around on the battlefield in the meantime is ever going to be relevant either. At number 7, it's Numai Outcast. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 1/1 with Bushido 2, which means when it blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and it can also regenerate if you spend 1 black mana and 5 life. So 4 mana 1/1s are absolutely abysmal, and we'll be seeing several on the list. It's very hard for a creature with that stat line to be good because they are so easy to kill with incidental ping effects or 1 mana removal, and that kind of mana inequity goes a long way towards losing you a game. I have done a top 10 on the best 4 mana 1/1s, where we saw exceptions to this fact, but Numai Outcast definitely isn't one of those. Bushido 2 does mean that it can block kind of okay if it really needs to, since it can take down X3s, but as an attacker, it's downright laughable. Your opponent can just always take 1 damage from this thing, and it's not really going to be a problem, and while its regeneration does make it kind of hard to kill, the cost of that regeneration ability is just way too much. The mana is fine, but 5 life? That is way too much to pay to keep a terrible attacker and blocker on the battlefield. Give me Drudge Skeletons every day of the week over Numai Outcast. At number 6, it's Aven Trooper. Another 4 mana 1/1. This one costs 3 generic and a white and comes with flying, and you can pay 2 generic and a white and discard a card to give the trooper +1/+2 until end of turn. So like Numai Outcast, this is a creature with one of the worst stat lines in the game, and an ability that is rarely worth it. Even if you removed the discard a card part of the buff effect, it wouldn't be good. There's actually a little bit of upside to be gained by discarding, like putting things in your graveyard that you want to reanimate or casting cards with madness, but there are so many other cards out there that let you discard without paying a mana cost that this isn't worth it in any way, shape, or form. It's always hilarious to compare this to another white creature from the very same block, Patrol Hound. It costs half the mana, has double the stats, and can discard cards for no cost at all while gaining first strike. At number 5, it's Mountain Titan. As a 4-mana 2/2, it comes with a more impressive stat line than most of the cards we've seen so far, but it's hard to cast because it costs 2 generic, a black, and a red, and its activated ability is awful. You can pay 1 generic and 2 red, and then, for the rest of your turn, whenever you cast a black spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Titan. Having to sink 3 mana into the ability makes it pretty difficult for you to actually cast any spells that will put counters on the Titan, and it's also super awkward that it costs 2 red mana to activate, since it simultaneously means he's demanding you have plenty of red mana and plenty of black spells. If you play Mountain Titan, he's just not going to grow, and even if you do pull it off, you spend way more mana than you should have to just to make the Titan stat line something slightly better than horrendous. At number 4, it's Warping Wurm. For 2 generic, a green, and a blue, it's a 1/1 with phasing, which means it phases in or out during the beginning of each of your untap steps, and while it's phased out, it's treated as though it doesn't exist. Furthermore, Warping Wurm phases out during your upkeep unless you pay 2 generic, a green, and a blue, and it gains a +1/+1 counter when it phases in. So, we're starting with yet another horrendous stat line, and while this creature can grow, it also doesn't exist about half the time unless you sink a bunch of mana into it. I don't know about you, but spending 8 total mana to attack with a 2/2 doesn't seem like a good plan to me. Keep in mind, by the way, phasing does not trigger interest triggers and the like. The creature never leaves the battlefield. It is on the battlefield, it's just treated as if it isn't. You can get queued and have it phase out and then wipe the board or something, but then you're trying to win the game with an incredibly slowly growing creature. It's just not worth the effort. At number 3, it's Reclusive Wight. Look, it's finally a 4-mana 4/4, a creature that is actually on rate. It's 3 generic and a black for that stat line, but boy does it come with a big downside. During your upkeep, if you control any other non-land permanents, you sacrifice the Wight. In other words, you just have to be able to win the game with Reclusive Wight when you play it, otherwise it's just going to go away, and winning with a 4/4 is a pretty big ask, even for a control deck that often just wants to play a single creature. Basically, this makes you really contort your entire deck and strategy just to keep it in play, and the upside is nowhere near worth it, and that was true even in an era when a 4-mana 4/4 was more impressive than it is today. At number 2, I've got Saprazzan Outrigger. The most efficient creature on the list, the Outrigger is 2 generic and 2 blue for a 5/5. However, when it attacks or blocks, you put it on the top of its owner's library at the end of combat. Yeah, that's a big problem. Not only does that mean you lose its presence on the board simply by doing the only 2 things it can do, attacking and blocking, you also have to put it on top of your library, and thus you're going down an entire card, since you're forced to draw this horrible creature again on your next turn. And then you also have to spend the mana again to get it on the board before continuing this horrible cycle. The good news is, that cycle won't continue for long because you'll lose the game pretty quickly. However, I do think there is one 4-mana creature that is even worse, and that card is Wood Elemental. If you knew this card existed, you probably knew it was going to be number 1 going into the list. It's just one of the most well-known awful cards in Magic. For 3 generic and a green, it's a star, and when it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice any number of untapped forests, and Wood Elemental's power and toughness are each equal to the number of forests sacrificed as it enters. So the big problem here is that it only allows you to sacrifice untapped forests. That generally means you can't sacrifice the forests you use to cast the Elemental. I've been talking a lot in this video about how bad 4-mana 1/1s are. Well, for this to be a 4-mana 1/1, you also have to sacrifice a forest, and it never really gets efficient. If you have 8 mana, you have a 4-mana 4/4 that made you sacrifice 4 untapped forests. And sure, there are some incentives out there for sacrificing lands, but there are so many other cards that do that in green that aren't incredibly narrow. I mean, if you want to sacrifice a bunch of lands in green, just use something like Sylvan Safekeeper or Spitting Spider, which actually do some other stuff. Wood Elemental is maybe the worst creature ever printed in Magic, and it's an easy pick for the worst 4-mana creature ever printed. So those are my picks for the 10 worst 4-mana creatures. Don't believe these cards are awful? Well, you can buy them at Card Kingdom. You can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards ever printed, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. Lastly, if you'd like to give back to the channel, you can by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find out how to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.